Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999, Cherif Bassiouni has been a leader in the efforts to create an international criminal court for the world. He is a professor at DePaul University College of Law. He spearheaded the documentation of war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. He also worked very diligently in the creation of DePaul's International Human Rights Law Institute. We're speaking today on the occasion of his receiving the Order of Lincoln for the state of Illinois, the state's highest award for individual achievement. Professor, it's very good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
I'd like to start with a little bit about your early life. You come from a family of lawyers in Egypt. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, both of my grandfathers were very distinguished lawyers, and I think this sort of condemned me, in a good sense, to becoming one. My maternal grandfather was a civil lawyer. He dealt mostly with civil matters, but he was the lawyer for the royal palace. In those days, in the late 1800s, the members of the royal family were not subject to the ordinary civil courts, and so if there was a suit of any type, he would be the one who would represent the palace or the members of the royal family. So he was a little bit on the, if you will, aristocratic side, whereas my paternal grandfather was a criminal defense lawyer, and he was a populist. And in fact, he led Egypt's revolution against the British occupation in 1919, which led him to be arrested by the Brits and sentenced to death for having tried to have Egypt be freed. But by those days, England was wise enough, and so he was soon released and became one of the authors of Egypt's first constitution. So in a sense, he was like the drafters of the U.S. Constitution, so he became very famous and was elected to the Senate, the first Senate, in 1923, and became a famous senator lawyer, and was president of the Bar Association for 17 years. And so as a kid, I think that along with what kids are taught, I was constantly fed of the stories of my two famous grandfathers, and that sort of sealed my fate.
With that in mind, with your grandfathers, your father was a diplomat?
He was, yes, he was. My father escaped law. He became an economist and studied economics in England. And I recall when he told me that he took a master's degree in economics, I thought, well, this is not particularly impressive. And he said, well, son, you have to remember it was in 1927. And in all of England, there were only 7 who got a master's degree in economics. And so it sort of gives you a different sense of proportion of the value of what higher education was in those earlier days.
You began your studies in law in France.
I did. I went to, when I was in Egypt, I went to a Jesuit grade school and then high school and junior college. And took, well, we can say equivalent to secondary education, which is called the baccalaureate, but which in those days was about the equivalent of 1 year of college, because it was 1 year more than the number of years of high school. And there's an official examination both in France and in Egypt. And so I took both examination, and I got the French and as well as the Egyptian baccalaureate. And then my father decided I should go study in France. And so I went to study at Dijon University, and so that was my first education continued in French, yes.
Were your studies interrupted by the crisis in your home country?
Well, it was. It was very exciting when I went to France, I must say. It was probably one of the most intellectually rewarding experiences I've had. I was very young. I was 17 and a half in my first year of law school. My youngest classmates were 19 and a half or 20, and I was the only foreigner in the freshman class. And so I felt a great deal of pressure. But I did very well. And in those days, this was the last year in France where legal education was in 3 years. And so I did very well in my first and in my second year. And then going into my third year, there were signs that France and England and Israel were going to attack Egypt in 1956 after President Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. And so I felt the resurgence of patriotism, and so I just decided to go back and went back to Egypt, and couldn't find any place to go to because the regular army didn't have volunteers. But the National Guard had a special forces unit, a sort of a commander unit, to which I joined and was the equivalent of a second lieutenant in the Suez Canal War. So that interrupted my studies in France.
You were decorated for your service, and afterward you went back to Europe. You were at the University of Geneva.
I did. When I went back to France to continue my studies, my student visa was not renewed because while I was in the Egyptian army after that part of the Suez Canal War, I trained a number of Algerian officers who went to fight in the Algerian Liberation Army for their country. And this was the height of the French war to continue its colonial domination of Algeria. So they didn't renew my visa and sent me packing, which was very tragic because I was ordered to leave actually on the 24th of April, and my final exams were about the last week of May. And that's where the relevance of my earlier statements were about my doing well in my first 2 years. I was assured of being among the 10 top of my class, if not better. But certainly I was going to pass. And not being able to sit in for the exam at about a month distance was quite devastating. But the more rewarding experience was that as I left, the dean of the law school asked me to his office and introduced me to a professor of administrative law. And I didn't know him. He was a younger member of the faculty. And he said that this professor was commissioned by the entire law faculty to represent me before the highest administrative tribunal to try to get the decision reversed. And so to have the feeling that the entire law faculty was supporting my right to sit for my final exams, I think is one of the most rewarding things that I cherish all of my life.
Gave you a real sense of the importance of standing up for what's right, to protect an individual's rights.
It does indeed. It was a very important symbolic sign. It wasn't that people agreed or disagreed. It was just people stood up for the rule of law.
When you went to Geneva, there was interest there at that time, in the years after World War II, in the foundation of an international criminal court.
That's correct. I was very fortunate when I went to Geneva. I studied with the then dean of the law school, and he was at the time the president of the International Association of Penal Law, which is the oldest and largest scholarly association of people in the field of criminal justice. And it's amazing that I have, after years, succeeded him in being president of the association. But in 57, I had no idea what the association was like. And here was this professor who took me under his wing and introduced me to the work of the association and to the fact that the association had, since 1924, urged the establishment of an international criminal court.
There was a time when you went back to Egypt.
I did. Afterwards, I went back to Egypt to finish my Egyptian law degree, and from there I left and came to the United States. And when I came here, everybody said, "It's wonderful, you have a great background, but now it's time to start all over again." So it was quite an experience.
Started over at the University of Indiana, or Indiana University?
I did. I arrived in New York, and it was a very interesting story that happened, which I'm also very fond of. my mother, who had been in the States before, had an attorney in New York who took care of her business matters, and he sort of felt compelled to take me out to dinner, as my mother had suggested he give me some advice on what to do. And he took me to his club, which happened to be the Harvard Club, and I could tell that he was not particularly enchanted with having to spend the evening with this young immigrant who wants to go to law school in the States and seeking advice. And as we walked in, he saw at another table there was somebody he knew from the New York bar who was with somebody else, and they said hello to each other, and it appeared quite clear that his other confrere in the legal profession was taking somebody out that he had to and wasn't too happy with it. So both New York lawyers decided to join their miseries, and so the four of us sat together. And as we sat together, we started chatting, and the other lawyer said, well, this gentleman here is Ben Small, he's from Indiana, and you sort of could see the feeling of, you know, he's from Indiana. I mean, the way it came out was sometimes the way New Yorkers manage to get things out about Midwesterners. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned that I wanted to go to law school, and I had applied to Harvard and had been accepted, but when I found out the tuition, I realized I just simply couldn't afford it. And so this other gentleman, Ben Small, and God rest his soul, turns around and said, well, would you like to come to Indiana University? And I said, well, what's particular about it? He said, well, I can offer you a tuition grant. You can get a scholarship. And I said, you mean I don't have to pay anything? He said, you don't have to pay anything. So I said, well, how can you arrange that? He said, I don't have to. I'm the dean. And so we shook hands, and there it was. I left Harvard, and I went to Indianapolis. And I'll never forget calling a classmate of mine who was from Egypt, who was doing his doctorate at the time. And I wanted to do the JD, which was the first degree, and he was instrumental in getting my paperwork done. And so I called him up, and I said, you know, I've decided to go to Indiana. And he said, you know, I've always known you to be a hothead, but whoever leaves Harvard to go to Indiana? And, you know, in my naive way, I said, well, you know, I have to tell you, while I was in Egypt all these years, every year I would hear on the newsreels the Indianapolis 500-mile races. And never in my life I heard of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he said, you're incorrigible. So I wind up going to Indiana University on a tuition grant, thanks to the dean. It was very gracious to me, and it was, again, I must say, the Lord was very good to me. It was a most rewarding experience. I have to admit, Indianapolis was, at the time, 1962, a very boring city. They rolled up the sidewalks at 8 o'clock. But I have never in my life met nicer, more hospitable, kinder, and friendly people. And I will sort of always feel eternally grateful to those that I encountered there who made me feel so much at home.
It wasn't too long after that DePaul University had an opportunity for you. You wanted to develop courses in international criminal law here?
That's right. I was invited to join the faculty in '64, and I came on, and I told the dean at the time that I would do anything he wanted, provided I could start teaching international criminal law. And of course, the dean said that nobody has ever heard of international criminal law, and they hardly taught international law in those days here, except once every 2-3 years. So I agreed, and he said, well, but you have to teach criminal law for a while. So I said, fine, and I did. And in those days, you had to teach 3 courses a semester. So here I was in my freshman year of teaching, doing 3 sections of criminal law with an average of between 80 and 100 students in them. The evening school was particularly daunting. I remember walking in the first day of class. I was a young fellow in my mid-20s, and the evening classes, I think you could count the number of people who were my age. They were mostly older, some twice my age, but there were about 20 or so law enforcement officers, and some of them in uniform, some of them not in uniform, and they take their jackets off, and here they had all their hardware on them. And so here I was, a young freshman professor at the age of 24, 25, facing 80 students, all of whom are older than I am, with a bunch of cops with weapons on who had more experience in the streets than I did. And I came at it with a lot of idealism as well as enthusiasm, and I had some of the most extraordinary discussions with the cops in my class about the rights of defendants in the streets, and it got pretty heated, and I think I learned probably as much as they did.
You maintained an active interest, too, in international politics at this time. There was a book that you wrote that made you friends and enemies on both sides, called Storm Over the Arab World.
Well, that's true. I'd always, in a sense, I found myself, again, forced to have two lives. Having come from the Middle East, being fluent in Arabic, knowing a little bit about Islamic law and about the Arab-Israeli conflict, I was very much in demand, if I can use that term, to be involved in conferences, speeches, writings on the conflict in the Middle East. And I must tell you that in the 60s, there weren't too many people of Arab origin, American Arabs in this country, and very few of them who had the courage of being vocal. And to me, it was just a question of being as fair as I would about any other issue. And my attitude has been, and still is sort of, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. If I think that there's a cause and I think there's a certain righteousness about the cause, I'll just go ahead and do it. And so I was very much involved in a number of speaking engagements and writings. And in '69, I happened to be as a visiting professor at Stanford University. And I was paired in a couple of faculty-student discussions with what I think is one of the most eminent world historian, Arnold Toynbee. And I was just absolutely fascinated by the man who could write a history of world civilization and world history. And we spent hours chatting, and I was just like a sieve, just taking in everything. And he developed a certain sympathy for me, and we started talking of the interaction of law and history across cultural boundaries. And at the end, I said, I'm thinking of writing a book about what is the real movement in these Arab countries, this what I call the spirit of revolution, the spirit of radical change, moving from colonialism into new regimes, how they can wrestle with monarchies, and what the role of the Arab-Israeli conflict is in it. And I said, if I ever wrote a book, will you write the preface? And he said, yes. So I'm not sure if I wrote the book and then sought him, or if because he said yes, I decided to write the book. But I did, and I had a co-author, Gene Fisher, who was a wonderful fellow who passed away, God rest his soul. And the book was critical of Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. And unfortunately then, as well as now, there's a sort of a zero-tolerance approach when it comes to Israel. In other words, you could be 90% in support of Israel, but if you digress 10%, that 10% is sufficient to have the entire force of the pro-Israel establishment come down on you. And they came down very hard, and in fact, they made a deal with the publisher and pulled the book out before it was even sold. It was one of the most disgraceful manifestation of a violation of freedom of expression in this country. I can never prove it, but the bottom line is after the publisher published the book, sent it out for reviews, Not a single copy was sent out for sale. The entire stock was destroyed. And my information is somebody went to the publisher and said, how much is it to destroy the stock of books? And the books were destroyed. And my editor was able to salvage 100 copies, which I got, and I parsimoniously gave them out to friends.
Earlier in your life, you'd run into problems in Egypt for helping people of the Jewish faith.
That's right.
So the problem cuts across all cultures and all countries.
Well, that's true. When I was in Egypt after I came back from the Suez Canal, this was a time when the Egyptian government was deporting a number of Jews who were in Egypt, who some of them because they had French or British passports or no passport at all. And I had intervened in a number of cases, and it got me the animosity of the intelligence service. But I think it was more the positions that I also took against tortures and arbitrary arrest and detention, which caused my own arrest and winding up for 7 months in house arrest in Egypt as a result of that.
I've read that time in house arrest gave you a lot of time to think about and frame a lot of your thoughts on what later became things that you acted on in your public life.
House arrest was very traumatic for me. It's not as benign as you think. In the first place, the wooden shutters were all nailed closed. The telephones and electricity was removed. Those days there was no television, but radio was cut off. So I was cut off of all communications, and food was brought in once a day. I had no human contact. But the biggest fear really was not knowing what's going to happen. And because I had been threatened with either being taken out at any time and being shot or tortured, the being shot didn't scare me that much, I have to admit, but the being tortured did. And in the end, even though I could roam throughout the apartment, I think within about a month, 90% of my time was spent in my bedroom, and most of it was in my bed. And I sort of appreciated what it meant to be psychologically tortured. And again, when the good Lord gave me the opportunity in 1977 to be the co-chair of the committee that drafted the Torture Convention, and I drafted it, I added in it that torture is not only the physical infliction of pain, but the psychological infliction of pain, because I had gone through it.
You had a profound sense of what you were talking about.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
I'd like to jump ahead a little bit to the Camp David Peace Accords. In a number of ways, you've been operating behind the scenes in many of what later came to be famous agreements. You became friends with President Anwar Sadat and worked a lot of that.
You know, those people who have a chance to work in what, for lack of a better words, I would call the corridors of power, one can never really assess the degree of influence they have. It could very well be that some of them have a great deal, and it could very well be that they don't. And in this case, I don't want to project myself as having had more than my share. But we did an experiment, Mort Kaplan, who's teacher at the University of Chicago, and I, of sitting across the table and negotiating a set of principles. We did that in 1975. Remember, the last war between Egypt and Israel was 73. They had disengagement agreements, and there was nothing going further. Henry Kissinger's policy was step by step. Mort Kaplan and I said, this is ridiculous. You've got to start with an agreement on the principles. Then you can implement step by step. But you can't go step by step if you don't know where you're going. And so we set forth these step by step, and I remember as we drafted them, we had arrived to 13, and I was sort of troubled by the number 13. It was not a good omen number, and I've always thought the number 14 was a good one, if nothing else, the Woodrow Wilson 14 points. And so we stretched it out and rewrote it and made it the 14 points principles. And we convinced Chuck Percy, who was then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, distinguished senator from Illinois, to introduce it in the Senate. He had hearings on it. He wrote the preface to it. We started giving it publicity. And I went with it to President Sadat and others, and Henry Kissinger was against it. I then had a meeting with President Ford, and President Ford, of course, followed Dr. Kissinger's advice, and he was not in favor of it. And then there was a summit meeting between President Ford and President Sadat in Salzburg in '76. And I think they weren't getting anywhere, and somebody said, well, what about this idea of an agreement in principles? I cannot say that this is my direct contribution. I don't know how, but it did happen. And then they said, well, maybe. At which point, Kaplan and I revised our 75 document into a 77 document, updated it, again published it in the, thanks to Senator Percy in the Senate records, and distributed widely. And we have the print of it. Election time comes in, and there's a man coming through Chicago by the name of Jimmy Carter. In those days, he was so unknown, people used to say Jimmy who about it. And he comes and speaks at the Council on Foreign Relations, and so I'm invited to meet him, and I just hand him one of our pieces of paper. I know shortly thereafter I was called by the co-chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee or platform of the Democratic Party to say that candidate Carter wanted to meet me and others at a place called Plains, Georgia. And I said, well, is he paying for the plane? And he said, no, you got to come at your expenses. I said, I'm going to come at my expenses to go to see Jimmy who in Plains, Georgia? I don't even know where Plains, Georgia is. Fatal mistake, of course. Most of those who went there were appointed ambassadors and had cabinet positions afterwards. And so I didn't go, but I understand that the plan was to his liking. After he was sworn in, I was called to a meeting with a number of ambassadors at the request of Secretary Vance to prepare for his trip to the Middle East. And this was one of the options, and he took his trip. Israel was not very favorable. Syria was not very favorable. He went to Egypt. Egypt, realizing that neither Israel nor Syria had anything to offer, comes back with the proposal, yes. And so the idea was, all right, we'll convene a meeting and look at those principles. And I can only tell you that if you took the document, which was published by the Institute of Strategic Studies of the University of Chicago, and you compare the two languages, there's some uncanny similarity.
And the politics of the time and the personalities of the time, I would never have imagined Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin coming together and being the people who forged peace. As a young man, I never would have imagined it, and yet it happened.
I would not say that they had in any way compatible personalities. They were very different as people. Sadat meshed, for example, very well with Ezer Weizmann, who was Israel's former head of state and who was Minister of Defense at the time. He had an excellent rapport with a number of people, including General Abrasha Tamir, who was the Director General of Begin's office, with whom, by the way, I am still working on a project dealing with the Middle East. So it's interesting how things grow out of these types of relationship. But I think that Sadat was committed to the notion of peace, and so was Begin, and therefore the fact that they were compatible or had good relations had nothing to do with it. It's just that both sides had made a decision. They forged ahead with it. There were no really strategic conflicts. There's the Sinai Desert and the Negev Desert between Egypt and Israel. These are two countries. This is not a major issue of coexistence as it is with the Palestinians. So it was a much easier peace deal to make.
You worked at DePaul University toward the establishment of an International Human Rights Law Institute here. This was around 1990. What were the goals of that institute, and what did you hope to accomplish here?
Well, there are a number of goals. First of all, an academically based institute has to serve the academic community. So it was designed to be a vehicle for our students, how to train students, to involve faculty, and also to involve ourselves in major world issues, to bring our student and faculty's contribution to major human rights issues, and to bring human rights issues to our students. I had a sort of a thought that I still have today, and that is that you have to train the future human rights defenders now. And so every generation of young lawyers, future lawyers who come through our institute and who work not only in abstract ways but in practical ways are the future defenders of human rights. And human rights are universal. If you get accustomed to standing up for what is right, for a just cause, for what is fair, you'll do it for your neighbor, you'll do it for the person around the corner, and you'll do it for the person around the globe.
At the same time, you were still active in work for the United Nations. There was, about this time, or a little thereafter, of course, there was the war in the former Yugoslavia, and terrible things were being committed against other people. You worked directly with what came to be known as the 780 Commission that began the groundwork for what eventually became the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. Take me through those days, and what was your involvement in trying to, from Chicago, trying to find out what had happened there and document and start to build dossiers and cases?
First, I think it's important to realize that politics is something that happens at the local level and at the international level. Politics is what moves decisions at all levels. It's not always bad and it's not always good. Actually, most of the time it's mediocre or indifferent. And here we have the following situation. A conflict had gone on in a country that was breaking apart. It had the appearances of a civil war, but in reality it was the breakup of a federated system which consists of different ethnic groups. And as these different units broke up and declared their independence, and they're entitled to under the right of self-determination, the principal unit, which was Serbia, wanted to keep Croatia and Bosnia within the Republic of Yugoslavia, and so they sent their armies in to, if you will, crush the rebellion. But by then, these countries had sought their independence. Their independence had been recognized by the world community. As the conflict developed, two things happened. The first is the Europeans wanted to settle it and were hoping to settle it diplomatically, and started having negotiations led by an Englishman called David Owen. And the Brits and the French sent troops there as part of UN forces to monitor and peacekeeping. What happened here is a very critical point later on in the politics of things. As these troops went in, they went in on the assumption that things were going to work out diplomatically, that nobody was going to be hurt. And the stationing of these troops were in small units, maybe 100 men here, 300 men here, 500 men there. No artillery, no armor. In time, the French and British and other European troops that numbered over 30,000 were spread out in the country so much that they literally were hostages to the Serb forces, because they were in such small, unrelated unit without any heavy equipment and obviously without any air force. And so rather than being, if you will, a drive, a force that would lead people to peace, they became an impediment to the peacemakers because the Serbs could always take a group of them hostage. The second factor was nobody knew what the United States was going to do. And so in 1992, when the war was really at its height in terms of the terrible thing that was happening, which the press was reporting on, and if it were not really for the media, and if it were not for the NGO human rights organizations, the world would have never known of some of these terrible things, this policy of ethnic cleansing, the systematic rapes, the terrible tortures that took place. And governments didn't want to act, because to act would mean you've got to send troops. When the Europeans were stuck with their troops being held hostages, so they couldn't do anything, everybody was waiting on the United States. George Bush, father, was in the last 6 months of his campaign. He wasn't about to commit himself. Colin Powell was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and came out with his famous theory that sort of imprisoned him and the Bush administration, and now this Bush administration, of, well, we don't go in until we have a strategic interest at stake, which is the most absurd type of a policy you can think of in a global world like we are, as if you can distinguish strategic considerations from humanitarian considerations. Anyway, things were trapped as a result of Bush, the father, pulling back on military intervention. It was natural that Clinton, the candidate, was pushing for military intervention. I don't think Clinton thought about it, other than he was taking the opposite position of what the Republican president was. Well, that gave the Europeans and those in the former Yugoslavia the belief, if Clinton wins, America goes in with its force, with its troops, and the problem is solved. Clinton never thought about it. As has been frequently the case with the Clinton presidency, he used to say marvelous things, but there was such a big gap between what he said and what he did. So he comes in the administration, and people say, well, are you going to do it? And suddenly he's backing down. And he's not ready to send American troops. He simply is not ready to have body bags come in for the political consequences. So after a while, something has to be done. Well, Madeleine Albright, who is ambassador to the UN, says, well, why don't we do something like a Nuremberg type thing? Without realizing, of course, that at Nuremberg, the Allies had won a decisive victory and controlled the territory and controlled the witnesses. So it's a horse of a different color here. But anyway, she came up with the idea, and everybody said, well, let's start with an investigating commission. And the Brits were very much opposed, as were the Russians. And so they said, well, all right, well, let's set up a commission, and we'll see what happens. So they set up the commission. And the Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, who was an Egyptian, knew me for many years and knew that I had been actively working in support of creating an international criminal court and international criminal justice. And so he appointed me to the commission and then chairman of the commission, at which point we went to our first meeting, and it was absolutely fascinating in terms of the politics of it. Because here was the UN creating this commission with the biggest mandate since Nuremberg, and yet didn't give it a single penny to do its work. I mean, zero. Frankly, had they given the commission $1 million, which is a figure that would have been impressionable, $1 million wouldn't have made a dent in the work we would have had to do. But they could have said, well, we funded it with $1 million. But giving it nothing, was so, I mean, it's just so irrevocable. The bottom line is they didn't want us to do anything. And they didn't want us to do anything because we could have been, in their minds, a loose cannon on deck for David Owen. David Owen was negotiating peace. He had no carrots and no sticks. He had only his wits. And British and French troops were scattered throughout the former Yugoslavia. They could have been taken hostages or killed at any time. The last thing they wanted is a sort of a Don Quixote from Chicago originally from Cairo, coming in and muddying the waters and saying, you know, this guy Milosevic you're negotiating with, he's a war criminal. Well, it turned out to be later, but politics is a question of timing. Later, when Milosevic was indicted and arrested, he was out of power. He had signed Dayton. He had lost his political utilities. He could be handed to the prosecutor. At the time, he was head of state. He had an army. He was feared. And so they said, stay silent, stay quiet. Well, this was not my temperament, and so I decided to end-run the system. And I first went to the president of the university here, Father Richardson, and I said, listen, I need the space. So he gave me an entire floor. And I started recruiting people, and, well, you know how Midwesterners are. They're very generous in giving people. And I had a staff of about a total of 165 lawyers and students, mostly volunteers, about 15 paid staffers. I needed them full-time. And I established a database center, which, if I can analogize it, it's a little bit like, it was like an intelligence center. We had 5 modest computers that were linked together with a server, and we worked 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. We got information from all over the world. We packed all of that information in the database, and we started collecting the facts. And then I organized 35 field missions. We discovered, for example, 151 mass graves of anywhere between 5,000 and 3,000 bodies. We did the first 2 mass grave exhumations ever done there, including the commencement of the work on the major mass grave exhumation, a place called Vukovar, where over 200 Croatians who had been taken out of a hospital had been taken by the Serb militias and killed, including the supervision of a number of Serb senior officers who were indicted. We discovered over 800 locations where some 1.5 million people had been taken in prison for brief periods of time. We estimate close to 50,000 people had been tortured. We identified over 3,000 hamlets, villages, and towns that had been ethnically cleansed. And we did the world's largest rape investigation in history. It had never been done before. We obtained 575 affidavits of raped women who, of course, were identified and who could identify the perpetrators. We then organized an expedition in which I had 33 women volunteers, and we interviewed 223 victims and witnesses in the field during the war. We had 11 teams working for about 4 or 5 weeks each team. Each team consisted of 3 women. They're all volunteers. I had a woman prosecutor lead the team, a woman psychiatrist, and a woman interpreter. Most of the psychiatrists and the psychologists, by the way, came from Rush Presbyterian School right here in Chicago, because I went there and talked to the director of the program, and both he's a psychiatrist and an MD, and his wife is on the staff, and both were very gracious and gave me the support that we needed. I got prosecutors mostly from Canada, the United States, but also as far away as Bangladesh. I thought it was very important for the women victim to be interviewed by other women. And one of the things I wanted to do, which was maybe inconsistent in a sense, I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to see if this was the product of a policy. And if it was a policy, it was the most heinous policy I could think of. And we needed to get to the top leaders. I did not want to accept the notion that a large number of victims of rape, and we estimated close to 20,000, that this was just a product of drunken soldiers, that this was a policy. And so I wanted to see if that was true. But I also had this extraordinary concern for the victims. Because I had been there, and I'd seen the devastations of war, and how, I want to use the word forlorn people are. When they've lost their house, they've lost their homes, they've lost everything. And they have nothing. And the whole world has sort of forgotten them. It's almost impossible to repeat or to feel what these people felt. And I felt among the many victims that we interviewed, the people, the women who had been separated from their husbands and children, who didn't know whether their husbands and children were alive, who had seen family killed around them, houses blown, who had been kept in places where had been raped continuously and consistently and degraded and humiliated, and were living in a refugee camp, didn't know what the future of their lives were. So to me, the human part of it was almost more important than the bigger part of the story. And so I instructed my teams. I said, listen, the very first thing I want you to tell these people is, we're here on behalf of the world, the United Nations, to tell you that you're not forgotten. And that we're here to bring you the world's solidarity with you, and through you, we want you to pass it on to the other victims. And, you know, it's extraordinary. There isn't a time in 223 cases that we interviewed where the victim didn't break down, start crying, and fell into the arms of one or all three of the women interviewers and said, thank you, we thought the world had forgotten us. And that, to me, was the most rewarding of all the experiences. And we were able to document, for the first time in history, a policy of systematic rape.
And to date, how many people have been prosecuted?
Well, unfortunately, very few. The Yugoslavia Tribunal, maybe I should, as a passage here, after we collected that data, and we produced a report which was the longest report in the history of the Security Council, 3,500 pages, backed by 65,000 pages of document, backed by 300 hours of videotapes and over 3,000 pictures. This evidence was so overwhelming that it forced the Security Council to establish a tribunal. And interestingly enough, I mean, this is totally insignificant, but it's an interesting point, precisely because I was so instrumental as chairman of the commission to bring about the evidence and force the situation into a tribunal. When I was nominated by the Secretary General to be the first prosecutor, Great Britain opposed it and led the bandwagon against me, not wanting me to be the prosecutor. And their lame excuse, which was published in the front page New York Times, was so shameful. They said, well, we can't have a prosecutor who is a Muslim, which is something that, of course, if it was anything but a Muslim, if they would have said a Jew, the whole world would have been up in arms against them, and in fact they did appoint a Jew afterwards as a prosecutor. But the point is, they felt they could say it with impunity, in a sense, because the Muslim world is weak, it doesn't count, and there isn't a strong Muslim constituency in the United States that was going to rally to my support. And the implication, of course, was that I would be partial to the victims. And I recall answering Paul Lewis of the New York Times when he asked me that question. And I said, well, don't you expect the prosecutor to be partial to the victims? Isn't the role of a prosecutor to take on the cause of the victims? It's up to the judge to be impartial. And the question you have to ask is if this prosecutor will be a person of integrity and handle the evidence with integrity. But partiality, of course, I have to be partial to the victims, no matter who the victims are. They could be Serb, they could be Croats, they could be Muslims. Doesn't make a difference. Well, finally the tribunal was established, and after I was vetoed, it took about 14 months for the Security Council to establish a prosecutor. And by then they had disbanded the commission, and they hoped that there would be no connection. But as soon as I found out who the prosecutor was, I called him up in South Africa, and I said, Mr. Goldstone, you don't know me. And he said, but I know you. And I said, you know, I want to link up with you. I want to help you. And so he arrived in The Hague on a Friday. I was there on a Sunday, and I brought him all of my evidence and some of my staffers. And in fact, when I walked into his office, I said, do you have a map of Yugoslavia? And he said, no. And I said, well, here's your first map. And do you know who are the people fighting here? And he said, no. And I said, well, here are the people fighting. And so this is how it all got started. But the tribunal, I think, has done a lot, and it's one of those situations in which is the glass half full or half empty. On the half empty side, people are going to say, there's only 20 people who have been tried so far. There's only been 5 convictions, 74 indictments, about a dozen people waiting for trial, and it cost about $400 million. So it's a lot of money. On the full side, this is the first time in history that a sitting head of state was indicted for crimes against humanity, and now he is before the tribunal. How much do you want to value the cost of principle? How much is it worth to prove a historic point that a head of state who commits crimes against humanity or genocide or war crimes can be brought to trial? In my opinion, it's invaluable. And I don't think we should make a cost-benefit analysis. It was thanks to the Yugoslavia Tribunal that the Rwanda Tribunal was established. And without it, it wouldn't have been. Again, is the glass a little more empty? Yes, it is. But that's because the world community seems to be less interested in Africa. And so you have a sort of a benign neglect about the Rwanda Tribunal. More emphasis is given Yugoslavia. In fact, so far there have been 8 prosecutions in Rwanda at the cost of $200 million, but that means that they got half of what the Yugoslav Tribunal got. The Security Council made the terrible mistake of appointing the same prosecutor as prosecutor in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Well, the bottom line became the prosecutor stayed in The Hague and took care of all of the Yugoslavia business and very little of the Rwanda business. And so the Rwanda business became a second-class international tribunal, as if the Africans are second-class people of the world that we have to be concerned with.
And this is precisely why there needs to be a permanent international criminal court.
Indeed. I think that you see, one of the main elements of justice, and we see that everywhere, is justice has to be for all. It can't be occasional. You can't say, I'm going to have a tribunal that is going to prosecute only people in one side of town and not in the other side of town. The rule has to apply to everybody. People who commit genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, whether it's in Africa, Asia, any part of the world, ought to be subject to criminal prosecutions. Now, it's important to note that the International Criminal Court is not a supranational tribunal. In other words, this is not going to take the place of national jurisdiction. This is only complementary. It enters into play. It's a fail-safe system. If national systems are not going to do their job, are going to falter, are going to break down, then you need an international organization to come in and fill the vacuum.
And I know we're drawing short on time, but that makes it even that's one of the things that makes it even stickier to pass, because the United States has problems with the way things might be administered and so on.
The United States' position is both an ambiguous and, in my opinion, not a very honest position. And I say that with full understanding that I served as chairman of the drafting committee of the treaty at the diplomatic conference, and so one may say that I have a stake in it. But here's the point. The court is not substituting for national criminal justice systems. It only operates if a national criminal justice system has collapsed or refuses to do what it has to do. The 3 crimes that I mentioned are all crimes under U.S. law. All of these crimes are part of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the Articles of War. For us to say that we're afraid of these crimes is tantamount to saying that we're going to cover up for our people who are going to commit these crimes. Because it is contrary to U.S. law. This is not new. And if it is contrary to U.S. law, then we have the obligation to prosecute here. What are we saying to the world? That we do not intend to prosecute here? The idea of saying, well, but our American troops are going to be subject to prosecution everywhere in the world is absolute nonsense, because the statute is clear that domestic jurisdiction has priority. I think the real problem is just an ideological problem. The U.S. doesn't want to be answerable to anybody. The U.S. military are also, I think, maybe afraid that politicians may make a mistake and that they would be left holding the bag. That take the bombing in Serbia where a target had been identified, which turned out to be the Chinese embassy. Is the Air Force is going to say, somebody gave us these coordinates, why should we be responsible for it? So the reality is that there is what I would call the embarrassment factor, which is what really happened with the Chinese embassy. The United States had to send a team to China and apologize by saying they made a mistake. But we make a lot of mistakes, and we sometimes are loath of wanting to admit it because we're the big guy on the block.
And at the time we're talking, how many nations have ratified it, and how many are needed?
We have 136 countries that have signed the treaty. 37 countries, as of this date, have ratified it. 30 other countries are in the process of ratification. We need 60 for the treaty to enter into effect. That means that sometime in 2002, at the end of 2002, it will enter into effect. Interestingly enough, all of our NATO allies, except Turkey, have ratified it. And so the idea that, it's going to target countries that send troops abroad, all of the countries that send troops abroad, Britain, France, Norway, Sweden, Italy, they've all ratified it. So this is really the sort of unilateral isolationism that I think has unfortunately marked this administration, trying to be a little bit too overly demagogical without realizing that in the age of globalization, you cannot only globalize business. Justice is part of globalization.
When this is finally gains final approval, will this be the accomplishment that, over a lifetime of many accomplishments, will this be the one that you'll be most proud of?
It's hard to say. To be realistic, I think that the International Criminal Court, once established, will sort of take a long time to get on its own feet, as any new institution does. It's not going to sort of immediately come out of the ground and be very effective. It's probably going to make some mistakes. It'll take a number of years to evolve. Think of what the United States Supreme Court did, how long it took for the Supreme Court to evolve. I mean, for the first 100 years, the Supreme Court didn't even have a court of its own. It sat in different places, in different rooms of the Senate, until finally it came of its own, and it took a long history of evolution. I'm not going to be around when that happens. I think that, a lifetime of accomplishments never winds up, or at least seldom winds up, with a big bang. It's not like with the movies where you have an extraordinary finale of a happy ending of something coming into fruition. You sort of take stock at the end, and like in a balance sheet, you say, did I do as good as I could, and are the credits a little better than the debits?
If I can show progress.
That's right. If I can just add a little bit of grain of sand and know that by doing that I can have the gratification of it, and one day when I meet my maker, I'll be able to say, I'm sure I could have done more and better, but I tried to do the best I could.
Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.